It's Indiana number 5 at Ohio State number 2 in one of the biggest games in program history. Let's talk about it. Hey everybody, it's Mike Schumann of the Daily Hoosier here for another episode of East 17th Street with Seth Tao and Owen Graham. Guys, it is arguably the biggest game in the history of the program that's been thrown around a lot in the last couple of weeks. As the resident historian of this crew, probably only because I'm the oldest, you guys probably still know more than me, but I've been around the longest. I put together last week the games that I could compare to this one for Indiana, with the criteria kind of being, a nationally relevant type of game late in the season. Because obviously Indiana's played Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State a ton, but it hasn't always mattered a whole heck of a lot, even if it was, early in the season when everything was still there. But this late in the season, the four other games I could come up with that had any parallel to this: 1945. That was Indiana's undefeated Big Ten title season. They played Purdue in the final game. Purdue was good. They were number 18, and Indiana won that game. They canceled classes on Monday to give you a sense for how big it was. The 1967 game, also against Purdue. Purdue was that was Purdue's heyday. They were really good then. Indiana had to beat them to clinch a chance to go to the Rose Bowl. They were number 4 going into the Rose Bowl, so that was still a very nationally significant game for Indiana. There's a game in 1987 that's a little under the radar in Indiana's history. The Hoosiers played Michigan State, a couple games to go, and it was widely seen as you win the game, you're in the Rose Bowl. They went up to Spartan Stadium and lost that one, but it was at the time it was a very big game and part of a very big season that Indiana had already beat Ohio State and Michigan that year. And then the one that's a little bit more recent for Indiana is 2020. It doesn't quite fit in the same in terms of being late season, but it was a top 10 game at Ohio State. I believe Indiana was number 9. Ohio State was top 5. Indiana got down 28 in that game before they came back and, had 2 chances with the ball in the fourth quarter to win it. If they had won that game, they would have made it to the Big Ten title game. And probably ended up in the CFP. So those are the 4 I could come up with. And this one feels different, honestly, than all of those guys. On the line today is a Big Ten championship game appearance and a bye in the CFP. Do you guys think I have that right, or are we overstating the significance of this game?
I'd have to say you're right. I mean, I would think that with everything on the line and giving the history of Indiana football not being that good, I think it is completely fair to say that this is the biggest game in IU history. I want to take you guys back to the time where I had like that question mark when I predicted that Indiana could go 11-1. And I was like, well, maybe it could happen, maybe it not. And we were still thinking back then that it was crazy to say. And then now we're here and they have a chance to go 12-0 in the regular season and appear in the Big Ten. So, I mean, it is probably the biggest game in history. I think there's a lot on the line in terms of the 12-team playoff is new this year. Even having your name in like the playoff conversation when in the first year that this 12-team format is pretty cool. So I think there's a lot at stake for Indiana going to Columbus.
Yes, Seth, I gotta admit, coming up with this list was pretty easy. The cheat code was there's only a few seasons you really had to look at. I kind of felt bad as I came up with it for like an Ohio State writer. If they had to come up with their 5 biggest games in program history, man, you'd have to spend weeks coming up with that. So maybe in 10 years it won't be such an easy thing to do, but sitting here right now, it's quite the task, or not quite the task, I should say.
Yeah, and it's definitely rises to that level. I don't want to, I try to be cautious a little bit. Like, I don't want to say it's the single biggest game, because is it really, I mean, is it bigger than when they actually played in the Rose Bowl? I mean, but
Right.
you're kind of you're splitting hairs at that point, and it's very clearly, in that, range of top 5, top 10, whatever you want to call it, biggest games in program history for sure. This is, and you can look at it also that this is the biggest game in what you could probably say is the best season in program history. And I guess the point, to be fair here, is that if they win this game, it's the biggest game in program history for like 2 weeks, and then you run
That's
that
right.
track back again.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And you mentioned a good point there about the Rose Bowl in '68. I thought about that game. Part of the criteria I should have laid out is regular season game. Generally most of Indiana's bowl game appearances have been more like exhibitions, really, not a lot at stake in the at the end of the day. That one was different. They were number 4 against number 1 USC. I don't know if they had won that game convincingly, if they could have leaped number 2 and 3 and won a national title. I don't recall the conversation from that. It didn't end up being relevant. So you may very well be right that there was at least some thought at the time that had much more on the line.
Even so, I mean, playing to win the Rose Bowl is something.
Right. Yeah. No doubt about it. Especially then when you didn't have a playoff and
Right.
it was funny even looking back at that year because Indiana fell out of the rankings after they lost in week, what was it, 9? Because they only ranked 10 teams. I mean, everything was just different. But they turned around and beat Purdue and jumped all the way back up to number 4. So it was just different eras, all of these games really compared to today. Even the '87 game. Bill Mallory went into the Michigan State locker room after the game and gave Michigan State a pep talk. I mean, I can't tell you the last time I've seen an opposing coach do something like that. So all of these are separated by generations, really. And here we are again. But I want to get into, we didn't do a podcast to talk about Indiana extending Curt Cignetti's contract. And I have to say, I felt like they had to do it, but the precision, the execution, the determination to get that done the way they did it. And if you listen to Scott Dolson over the last week, he said they started the process 5-6 weeks into the season. It's something that had to be done, but to actually see Indiana, who's just never really had this kind of commitment to football, do exactly what had to be done with precision, get into the kind of numbers where they had to be. It was a very impressive set to see them actually, step forward and get it done. Because let's face it, any major college football program that had a job opening, Curt Cignetti, if he was a number 1, he was 1A. I even saw people putting him on NFL list. I mean, when you turn around 3-9 Indiana to 10-0, that turns a lot of heads.
Yeah, and let's be clear, we haven't seen the exact contract yet, and the new contract, is great. It may not stop, like, if there's an NFL team that really wants Curt Cignetti, it may not stop them from approaching him
Sure.
and at least and hearing, and who's to say what would happen. But yes, it's a step that Indiana clearly, as we saw how this season was progressing, had to take if they wanted to, keep Cignetti in Bloomington. And again, maybe he wouldn't have left to begin with. Maybe he was just in here regardless and wasn't going to hear out, various other pitches. But it's one thing to say that, and another thing to actually be hearing a bunch of pitches come your way and not have further guarantees from IU. It's interesting to think that, like, we talked a little bit, throughout the season about just the weirdness of this year's schedule, that you don't get too many years where you get 2 bye weeks in one season. And that turned out to be kind of fortuitous with IU
Right.
here, because if they didn't have this second bye week late in the season, I mean, that kind of allowed them to get this. I'm sure that, like you said, the process had started early on in the season, but I would imagine that Curt Cignetti wasn't talking too much about, an extension or a new contract outside, during a game week. I would imagine that getting a second bye week this season was probably fortuitous for IU and getting this deal done and locking it up when they did.
Yeah, that's a great point. It certainly helped enable the process. And Owen, I think about, Seth's point about what else is in that contract. You hear rumors about greater pay for assistants, which I think is a must if you're going to have any hope of keeping that staff together. I mean, look, Mike Shanahan and Brian Haynes are probably at the top of a lot of lists for head coach, which if people want them for head coach, you just got to let them go. But what you can't have is somebody coming in and saying, okay, we'll offer you Mike Shanahan 1.8 million. You're only making $1 million at IU, and he leaves. That's a situation you have to avoid if you're Indiana. And we'll find out if they've done enough in that regard. The other thing is potentially. We've seen in other cases like Kansas where, they had a up and coming coach that they wanted to secure long term, and they tied in facilities upgrades into his contract. That's something I'm going to be really interested to see if it's specifically in there or if it's more just like a handshake understanding.
Yeah, you'd think, with the facility upgrades, I know they did the weight room, excuse me, and then the Millennium Pavilion got their big turf update as well. But even like taking, I know Cignetti says it all the time that he's like wanting to build the program like bigger than what it is. And that could include, possibly extending Memorial Stadium with more seats. And we've kind of gotten a baseline plan for that already kind of happening. I think that's been reported on even prior to this season. And now it's kind of gaining a little bit more traction. But yeah, just kind of, building the facilities around the football team is probably, I would imagine, could be certainly a part of his contract for sure.
It's such a wild shift here. I mean, we've gone from 3 years of conversations of nobody going to Indiana games, empty seats, all that. Now in 10 weeks we're talking about building a second deck in the East Stands or expanded luxury suites and whatever they could possibly do. I remember each time they made the major updates on the end zones, there was it was almost like Indiana was apologizing for adding seats, especially in the north end zone. It's like they had to point out, well, we only added 5,000 seats, because they knew the reaction was like, why in the world are you adding seats? Nobody goes to these games. and somehow here in 10 weeks we've gotten to the point of talking about, I don't know how many seats you would potentially add, but it's just a wild time. But the first thing you had to do was extend Cignetti to make sure that the kind of the foundation was there to even make the rest of it make any sense.
Yeah, I want to jump in on the staff point real quick that you mentioned too, because I think if the pay is going to matter in some sense when you're talking about guys like Shanahan and Brian Haynes, if they get head coaching offers, if they want to be head coaches, slight pay difference, depending on the location, it might not matter. If they want to be a head coach, they may just leave. But I think what you also need to be looking at, where that can make a big difference. If those guys leave, and get head coaching offers, that may just be, it is what it is. But I think you're looking at, that might help you keep Tino Sunseri in town if you want him to, potentially step in and be your offensive coordinator if Mike Shanahan leaves. Or, he could get head coaching looks for all we know, guys, on the assistants. But if somebody, tries to, if somebody else around the country wants to go bring in Tino Sunseri as offensive coordinator, that might help. This might help Indiana keep Tino Sunseri in town. You could say the same maybe about like Pat Kuntz. I don't know which defensive position coaches might be getting looks, thought of as like defensive coordinators. But, say it was Pat Kuntz, obviously that big personality, like, somebody like that, like getting the assistant pool bump. Yes, it'll help you keep, it can make a difference with your coordinators, but it's the whole staff that's done a really great job with Indiana this year. And I think being able to keep, if you get that assistant pool jumped up even more, it's not just about the coordinators, it's about the entire staff.
The crazy thing that's happened here, and it's probably always been this way, but it seems like it's magnified now, is the pay for Power 4 assistants is probably at least at the top programs, is coming close to like doubling a G5 head coach. Like Signetti was making less than $1 million. I think what was it, like 800K at JMU, and he was a really highly regarded G5 coach at the time. So when you talk about these guys, if their first foray into coaching is at a G5 or even lower level of college football, they're going to take a significant pay cut to do it. So that enters the equation as well. I think ultimately you just kind of have to take that leap of faith, kind of like what Signetti did when he entered head coaching late in his career. I really like your point about Sunseri. I've thought about that a lot. You never know how he's going to do as a play caller, but it does seem like there's a lot of chemistry and symmetry there. And if Indiana were to lose Shanahan, he's the natural to step into that role. So that it does seem like there's at least a path to having continued continuity, even if you lose him there. But one last thing on the contract, and just the impact nationally that Signetti has had is I think every college football program that's having a season that's not up to their standards. I mean, I think this is going to be a reference point. Like, look what Signetti did at Indiana. Like, why are we not making a coaching change? Like, I think the timeline for patience with coaches, Signetti's literally going to have a national impact on that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, especially with kind of these, programs that maybe, are probably are Power 4, Power 5, but, kind of maybe on a similar spot with Indiana, that they, don't maybe have a rich football history, or they're gonna kind of continuously just kind of average. I mean, it's very safe to say that Curt Cignetti is kind of a trailblazer in the sense that, like you said, there's going to be zero patience, and they're going to go out and look for, maybe a lower level head coach that, has a good staff built around him and has a good mentality of just, trying to build that program up to that status. So, I probably can't give you a list of teams that like would do that in a second, but I know there's a ton of, programs that are just, kind of stuck in that kind of zone where IU has been. It's just not really having the same kind of football level impact that the school has ever had, and really kind of want a head coach and just need an entire change in the program. And I think
Right.
Signetti is kind of the kind of the baseline or the guide to what you want to do in that sense. And, is it going to be easy for those programs to just go out and find a head coach that is going to do the exact same thing that Signetti's going to do? No. But I think, like we kind of talked about, I think the mentality is the big thing, is just trying to, boast however you can, how you're going to build the program. And in turn, if the success comes, then the program is going to go up from there.
Yeah, and I think the blueprint for who you hire as a head coach might be another reason why Indiana could retain Haynes and Shanahan. I think the idea that we've heard Scott Dolson lay out, that you want to hire a guy who's a proven head coach, who has a proven record of winning. I don't know how many Power 4 programs anymore are going to go out and hire a coordinator to lead their program. I mean, that's proven to be a challenging jump for a lot of people. So that will be something to watch as well. But I want to pivot to the game. At Ohio Stadium here, 102,000. Clearly the most challenging road environment Indiana will face this season. Michigan State was probably the next closest, but that was it started out with a pretty good crowd. I think you'd say, right, Seth, but I think it quickly, as that game turned, it turned into a partisan Indiana crowd towards the end of that game. But it's still not 102,000. Seth, you've been to Ohio Stadium, right?
Yep, I was there. Yeah, I was there in 2022 when Indiana played there.
What are your impressions? Because I don't always think like, 100,000 is like necessarily like a defining factor in a road environment. Like Tom Allen used to say, loud is loud. And it, I've been to Michigan Stadium several times, and Ohio State fans, if you're listening, you'll like this. I feel like it has a very corporate environment. It's not real impressive from a overall, visually it's very impressive. Like the
You're saying that about
fanfare.
Michigan?
Yeah. The fanfare at Michigan, the visual kind of spectacle is impressive, but like actually being an intimidating road environment, I've never been impressed with Michigan. I don't know how Ohio State compares.
When you went to Michigan, have you only been up in the press box, or have you sat out in the stands there?
I've been for both. And I just, part of it could be like you're thinking, oh my God, it's the big house. Like it's going to be crazy. And it just, every time I've been there, I think it's 4 times total. I've just never been like, wow, this is just a crazy atmosphere. So maybe it's just holding it too high of a standard because of its reputation.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, the only time that I've been to Ohio Stadium, I went down on the field level before the game, but I was in the press box during the game. And for my own personal reference, I've sat in the stands at the Big House. I sat in the student section for a game in, I think, 2018, and I've been both in the press box and in the stands at Beaver Stadium at Penn State. So those are obviously kind of the 2 reference points when you're talking about the horseshoe. I mean, I think you start to split hairs a little bit if you're saying,
Sure.
oh, one environment is slightly better than the other, or what have you. And the time I was in the stands for Beaver Stadium was the Indiana game in 2021, the night game, that stripe out game, which, I mean, obviously that didn't end up an amazing game for Indiana, but
Right.
that environment was, a night game. Penn State, they really do it great there. But I mean, obviously Ohio State is up there with all of them. Like I said, I can't really, attest to what it's like being out there on the field in the stands during the game. But I mean, it's up there with all of them in terms of the size of the stadium, all the fans like right on top of you, how, that I'm sure that could be a little bit intimidating for some, but yeah, I mean, it's clearly the biggest crowd that Indiana will have played in front of so far this season, the most hostile atmosphere. That Michigan State crowd, I mean, I don't think the stadium was really full probably at any point. It was a good crowd for Michigan State to begin that game, and obviously Michigan State started out really good, and then Indiana just jumped all over them, and I mean, it was pretty quiet by the 4th quarter. So it's a big test, this environment, but I'm looking forward to being there on Saturday. It's going to be pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think we've seen Indiana go over there and, seemingly be composed, at least at times. I'm thinking back to, there's a 2014 game when Tevin Coleman ran wild, and they stayed in the game well into the second half. I think Peyton Ramsey had a pretty good game there, if I'm remembering right, in 2018. So there have been moments. I don't think Indiana's going to be overly intimidated, but if what I'm afraid of for Indiana's sake is just like a snowball effect. Like, sure you can get down 10-0 against Michigan State and recover, but I think this Ohio State crowd will feed off any sort of momentum in the game, and it could get ugly fast if Indiana doesn't have composure at the start of this game. I want to talk about the point spread. It opened double digits. I think I saw it go as high as 13. And now I looked this morning, it's down to 10.5. I don't know if that moved down because of Ohio State's injury along the offensive line. It's not a small point. Sean McLaughlin, starting center. I didn't realize, but I've watched some people talk about him. He's regarded as like all-American caliber, legit contender for the Remington Award as the national center of the year. And people are saying Ohio State's offense is heavily dependent on the center kind of making calls at the line of scrimmage. So very significant loss, especially considering that they've already lost starting left tackle Josh Simmons earlier in the season. So, we'll get into the game aspects of that in a bit. But Owen, And we'll also do predictions, so no giving away the secrets here, but just your impressions when you saw Indiana open as a double digit underdog, and kind of how it's kind of stuck there, but it kind of seems to be trending Indiana's way late in the week.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's the most shocking point spread I've seen of all time. Um, I would have my personal, I guess, taking the injury into account, I could have seen it going like at around 7.5, like a touchdown and another score towards Ohio State. But the double digit is spread. I think it's fair. I mean, without going on my predictions, I think there's a world where Ohio State wins by 10 points. They win by 20, whatever. But again, it could also go the exact kind of opposite way. So, I mean, I'm not a sports betting person myself, but I think just as a kind of baseline prediction, I think it's kind of fair. I think they got it pretty well. And like you said, it kind of rose up a few points before it came back down, supposedly because of the injury to McLaughlin. But the double digits, I know a lot of Indiana fans weren't happy about it, but I think it's pretty fair.
Yeah, I'm not a bettor myself either, but I do really like looking at point spreads because it's the best indicator I know of where people genuinely think is going to happen. So, from that standpoint, I do like to pay attention to it. Seth, what's your reaction to kind of that aspect of the game?
Well, I do dabble a little bit more in that, in all of that stuff. So, well, I guess the first point to remember here is that yes, like the line opened at, whatever, a 12 and a half, 13 or whatever, but there have been books that have had this line up for weeks now. This isn't
Right.
like this isn't like a normal game that the books are just putting up a line on Sunday morning or Saturday night, or whenever they first post their lines. This is one of these games people have been anxious to put money down on for weeks now. So it was as high as 14 at some point before, and this line has really been fluctuating for several weeks now. So I think it had gotten down to like 9.5 at one point, maybe last week or something like that. And then it reopened at 12 or wherever it was. I think the line movement, late in this week, it has to be pretty related to the center injury, but it's also, I mean, I'm looking there. One of the an app that I use sometimes for this stuff called Pickett kind of shows you one of the things you can look at in here is how much the percentage of bets in there, how much what of all the bets placed on the game, what percentage is on one side and what percentage is on another side, and that can be kind of telling as far as I guess which side the public is on when you're looking at when in terms of total bets, I guess how much what's on what side and what's the other side, and in terms of the total money bet, what's on each side, and what each side of the percentage on the money. I think that usually tells you what side, like when you're talking like the real professional, the people that are putting down, a lot of big sums of money, like the people who gamble for a living, professional bettors. I think when you're looking at how much money is on each side, that can tell you where the professionals lie, and who knows what inside information or special numbers they might have. But when I'm looking at the spread here, the point spread, just how much 53% of the money per Pickett, 53% of the money on the spread is on IU, and 40%, so 47% on Ohio State. So that kind of tells me that the professionals that are coming in and betting on, the professionals that bet on college football, a lot of money every week, are leaning towards IU a little bit, at least with the point spread.
Right.
The public, it's very close with the public, like almost 50-50, in terms of bet percentage on the spread. But so that tells me the line is pretty close to where the books at least should want it, because you want it at a point where you're going to get equal people wanting to bet on both sides of it, and so that that's how the books win when you're talking about Vegas.
Right.
You want to pull in money on both sides. So I think 9.5. 9.5 feels like probably a good number that I think it's landed on. I thought I was surprised. I think early in the week when it was 13, 12.5. I thought that was a little disrespectful to Indiana.
Yeah.
I felt not pretty confident, but like I felt like Indiana could cover for I don't bet on IU games by any means because I cover the team. I think that's unprofessional. So I don't bet on IU games, but I thought that, seeing it at 13, 12.5, I thought that was a number that Indiana could cover. At 9.5, I feel like that's probably around right. Indiana definitely could still cover that, but that's, I don't feel as confident being like, that like Indiana's the right side here.
Yeah, and just an interesting side note on how sports books make or lose money. I had a PR firm reach out to me a couple weeks ago. I think they were representing MGM Grand, and they said MGM's largest current liability on bets for teams to make the CFP was Indiana. So I think a lot of IU fans got in early in the summer or early in the season and put in bets for Indiana to make the CFP. And, I'm sure it's not a massive number, but, I'm more curious as to why they reached out to me on that. I'm sure there was some underlying reason as to what they were trying to accomplish with that. But it was interesting.
I hope I didn't get too deep into the weeds there with some of the sports betting info, but I think the way the money lines up, I think that can be telling in some senses.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, Seth, you and I talked a little bit last night at Assembly about the stakes of this game. What happens if Indiana wins? What happens if Indiana loses? I think when the CFP update came out this past week, it wasn't really very exciting. We knew Indiana wasn't going to move very much, but this is the week really that, I think a win. We talked about this. I think Indiana's in the conversation for number one overall. I don't know if they'll get it if they win. It might come down to how convincing of a win that they have. But, you talk about, beating number two. You talk about being 11-0 in the Big Ten, having a more impressive win over Ohio State than Oregon because of it being at Ohio State. I think Indiana at that point in time, pretty much has a clear path to the Big Ten title game, and pretty much has a clear path to earn a bye in the CFP and be the number one overall. Am I overstating that?
No, not at all. I mean,
Nope.
I think I don't know that they'd for sure end up number one, but I think they'd very likely be getting a bunch of votes to be number one if they'd won this game. I think, you'd start to be, diving deeper into the resumes a little bit. And Oregon does have another good win over Boise State at the beginning of the season. That's going to carry some weight for them on their resume. Right. And that's, look, I know Indiana fans have been unhappy with, SEC heads and everybody bringing up the strength of schedule and everything. And there's a lot of valid counterpoints to that, but I don't think you can really take much away from Oregon. There's no real counter. You can't, as an Indiana fan, claim that any of the wins Indiana's had this season are better than Oregon beating Boise State. I think that, obviously the Ohio State win as well, but Oregon beating Boise State is a good win. Right. There's no taking that away from them. And Oregon also, I think, beat Illinois, which is, you can make reasonable arguments about, is Illinois better than like Washington or whoever, some of the, Nebraska or other teams that Indiana's played. But the Boise State win will would probably keep Oregon continuing to get votes for number one. But Indiana would definitely have a case to be number one if they won this game. And certainly I think it would be hard to put them any lower than number two if they won this game, because Indiana's number 5 right now before they've even played Ohio State. If they beat Ohio State, suddenly that's a better win than anything Penn State has done this season. And really that's a better win than anything Texas has done this season too. So it would be hard for me at that point to say they should be lower than, I think if they beat Ohio State, they shouldn't be any lower than number 2, and they would have a reasonable claim to be number 1.
And I guess as I sit here and think about it, it doesn't probably really matter all that much who they put number one between IU and Oregon, because they're going to play
Right.
in the Big Ten title game, and that
Right.
Yeah.
becomes the battle for the bye and the number one overall seed.
Right.
So the stakes in the Big Ten title game would be massive in that scenario. It would mean that Indiana would lose out on a host game if they were to run the table here and win their next three, including the Big Ten title game. Whereas if they lost, they could potentially host a game, but you don't want that scenario. You want to avoid having to play an extra game in the CFP. I guess looking at it on the other end of the spectrum, Owen, if Indiana loses this game, to me, it really comes down to how they lose. You don't want to lose the way Nebraska lost in Bloomington, 56-7. You want to lose how Nebraska lost at Ohio State, 21-17, which is really a fascinating comparable, especially considering those two games happened a week apart. But I feel like if Indiana just goes out there, competes, and it's a competitive game well into the fourth quarter, I don't think they're going to get punished too much. They'll probably fall back a few spots in the CFP, but I think they're going to make the case that, strength of schedule or not, that they are a playoff caliber team that can compete on the road against, a team who everybody believes is national top four. So I think that at that point they will be strongly in the CFP no matter what happens, assuming, of course, they beat Purdue. But if they lose ugly, then that's just fuel to the fire that we've been hearing for the last couple of weeks, that Indiana didn't play anybody. They finally played somebody. They got blown out. They don't deserve to be here. I see you shaking your head. Do you agree with all that, or what's your take?
I mean, yeah, I'm glad you brought this up, because I've been thinking about this for a while, and I've talked to people, other students, about this. And the thing that kind of just is questioning for me is that, yes, we know that teams like UCLA, Michigan, and Washington didn't have good seasons this year, and Indiana beat all of them. But coming into the season, all three of them were ranked in the top 25 preseason college football rankings. I mean, again, preseason to season is a lot of different, but I mean, at least looking at that side of things, those three wins are very, very strong wins. Also, people aren't taking into consideration that the Big Ten might just be a really, really tough conference in general, and that Indiana's 10-0 season is not what it seems to be. I don't understand that. Also, for some reason, people think Curtis Rourke should be benched in this game, which is completely egregious. I mean, it is. I don't understand. But I mean, you would have to think that if they competed at Ohio State, I mean, maybe even lost by 2 scores, that they should safely be in, because they can show that they can compete with a high level team that is more than likely, if they would win that game and win out the rest of the season, would be in the college football playoff. But it's such a painstaking process that they've had with the 4-team playoff in the past years, and it's coming back for the 12-team playoff, which was supposed to be eliminated just by adding more teams in, and it's still the strength of schedule, and I mean, it's all over the place. But I mean, you would think that, I mean, if Indiana competes in Ohio State, wins against Purdue, they should safely be in.
Yeah, I think so too. We welcome Ali with his regular appearance on the show here. Ali, anything to add?
He's feeling a little playful right now. I don't know what that means, but he seems like he's kind of playful.
He's fired up like me. He's fired up from this college football playoff discussion.
Yeah, that debate's got everybody fired up. Let's talk a little bit about each side of the football in this game. When Ohio State has the ball, what's really fascinating to me, looking at Will Howard's stats and comparing him to Curtis Rourke, they're having almost an identical season. Total yards, completion percentage, touchdown to interception ratio. The amount of times he's been pressured this year is almost identical to Rourke. So I think if Indiana fans kind of want to know what to expect with Howard, I think you kind of get a sense for the season Rourke has had, and that's pretty much the season Howard has had as well. People will say, he didn't have his best game against Oregon, and maybe he's not a big game guy. I'm not sure that's the case. I think he's a really good quarterback, probably a bit more of a dual threat than Rourke is. I think he runs a little bit better. But I think it might come down to Indiana's defensive line in this game, Seth. Their ability, what I think Ohio State's going to come into this game trying to do is control the clock. Like I think they would like to have a lot of 10-play, 80-yard drives and just limit the amount of touches Indiana even gets in this game. And Indiana's ability to limit the run, get off the field, and when it's third and long, get pressure on Howard. I think that's going to be kind of the key to this game.
Yeah, I mean, Will Howard is not putting up exceptional rushing numbers by any means, but I think if you're comparing quarterback mobility to Curtis Rourke, you're setting kind of a low bar
Right.
with what we've seen from Curtis Rourke this season. I think I saw Howard only has like 122 rush yards on the season, and to be fair, that also is taking into account sack yardage. So,
Sure.
When you factor that in, I'm sure, he definitely can move much better than Curtis Rourke. And that's something he's probably not the dual threat that you would say Aiden Childs was for Michigan State, or, I think FIU's quarterback, was the other quarterback that could really run it. So, and Northwestern's Jack Lausch could cause some problems with his legs too there. But, yeah, I mean, the defensive line, I think, is the big key for Indiana. I mean, that's really been the key all season.
Right.
That's what made Indiana so good this season. Is yes, the skill players, the quarterback play has been really strong, but football is won and lost in the trenches, and it's been the offensive and defensive line play that has been outstanding for Indiana this season and really driven the success. And that's why Ohio State's injury at center it could be so big, because suddenly you put a second string center in there this late in the season, like you say, at a position that's of high importance to that offense. And all of a sudden, I mean, CJ West and James Carpenter have both been playing really good football for Indiana, and you might open things up for the interior defensive line for Indiana, which can only open, that'll only make it life even easier for Mikhail Kamara on the outside and Linnell Carr and Indiana's other edge rushers. So, that's not to say it's going to be easy, because Ohio State's got other good offensive linemen. This isn't, the Ohio State's offensive line isn't going to suddenly be bad because they lost one guy, but sometimes that's all it can take, offensive line is just so chemistry based. And so it's just such a unit type of thing that, I mean, you can have one leg of the chair kind of, get a little wobbly and suddenly everybody looks bad. So, there's a little give and take with that. But yeah, the defensive line, I think, is going to be really important this game.
Yeah, I think you're going to know that things aren't going well in this game when Ohio State has the ball. If they're able to get chunk runs, 5, 6, 7 yards per carry, or if they're not getting pressure on Will Howard. Because I think if Indiana has a potential exposure here, it's that latter scenario there. If he's able to just stand in the pocket and has plenty of time, I think Ohio State's receivers are better than Indiana's defensive backfield, and that's no knock on IU's defensive backfield. I think they're very good. It's just that Ohio State has elite NFL caliber receivers that, if given enough time, are going to get open. I think Pons and Johnson have been really good for Indiana, but those are going to be difficult matchups if Howard is comfortable in the pocket for anything longer than a couple seconds. What's your reaction to that, Owen?
Yeah, I'm kind of with Seth here. I think the defensive line, I mean, has the opportunity with, I mean, the injuries that Ohio State has sustained on their offensive line. So, I mean, you like you said, like Seth said, I mean, when you generate pressure with CJ West and James Carpenter, that's going to cause problems. And that can also open up some things for Kamara, who's had just an insane season. I know, Mike, you're a big fan of Kamara and his numbers. So, I think that is going to be pretty key for Indiana, just generating pressure throughout the game. But like you said, if Will Howard has time in the pocket, I think, Ohio State's wide receiving class, or excuse me, just wide receiver room in general is one of the best in the country. I know it's kind of a reunion of sorts for Pons and Smith. They both went to the same high school together. So, maybe Pons knows some kind of secret weapon that Smith has at the line, and he can defend him better. But I mean, Jeremiah Smith is kind of really the guy that everyone's kind of looking at this season. Just a standout freshman wide receiver that can do just about anything. But again, just the generating the pressure at the line is going to be really key. I think you have to throw Will Howard kind of out of his comfort zone a little bit if you want to have any success on defense, because I mean, even in that Oregon game, besides that kind of last play where he had that little blunder, he looked really solid. And so, generating that pressure at the line is going to be really key.
Yeah, and you're right. I've been beating the drum for Kamara all season. I will say these are the games that a guy can clinch a spot as an All-American. If he has a big game today or Saturday, he can clinch a spot as first team All-American at edge rusher, because he's got a 7. At least last check, he's got 7 more pressures than anybody else in the entire country, which is a crazy margin when you're going to that level of comparison. So his ability to just take over games, no more obvious than the Michigan State game, but he's done it week in and week out. Really, it's just been incredibly impressive. So don't be surprised if Ohio State recognizes that and throws a lot of extra attention his way with running backs and tight ends kind of chipping him at the line of scrimmage. I think they're gonna have to do something to take away his impact on the game. But the real headline here is, when IU has the ball, this is strength against strength. This is the number 1 scoring defense in the country against the number 2 scoring offense. This is, in my opinion, where the game's ultimately really going to be decided. And it's interesting because the last time we saw this Indiana offense, they didn't look good at all. They had their worst half of football against Michigan. And I guess starting there, Seth, are you concerned that there's going to be a carryover effect? Part of what was going on there was Indiana has their own issues at offensive line. They've also lost 2 starters over the course of the season. The other aspect is that I think Michigan probably has the best defensive line in the country, or if not the best, one of the top 5. The PFF grades them as the number 1 pass rush defense in the nation. So it's legitimate to say that Indiana looked bad because they were going against one of the best units in the country there. But are you concerned at all with what you saw in that second half and it carrying over?
Maybe. Yeah, I think it's hard to it's difficult to say for sure, because I think a lot of that had to do with some of the injuries Indiana had both in that game, and I mean, they lost Drew Evans at guard. I'm not sure exactly when in the week that happened, but it seemed like it was later in the week, because it never came up in the early week media availabilities we had, and I feel like it would have. And so, if that switch happened later in the week at offensive line, and they plugged Tyler Stevens in with a couple days, that could have had an impact. And obviously, Curtis Rourke was still getting over his thumb injury, and Justice Ellison got banged up, and Miles Price got hurt and out for the game. And I know Omar Cooper got banged up. Just a lot of they took a little bit of a beating that game, and particularly on offense. Yeah. And I think some of that started to add up a little bit. But you're right. I think even all of that aside, there was some concerning tendencies, both from, I think the coaching staff it was the first time really all season. I think the coaching staff got a little conservative at some points in that game. Late in the first half, they, had a chance to really maybe go out a little bit more, and they opted to just run out the clock. And, that kind of set the tone for the momentum going into the second half. And it was, there are a few other moments where we saw them be a little more conservative, both, I guess on both sides of the ball, but really offensively. That was the first time really all season that we'd see them get conservative offensively. And I'm not real. I don't think I'd be concerned about that continuing, because it's one game of evidence with that happening versus, a whole, 9 other games worth where that didn't happen. And especially after Indiana just had a bye week to spend plenty of time simmering on that. I feel like I wouldn't be concerned necessarily about the coaching staff, what happened in that aspect of the game. But I mean, Curtis Rourke, the way he's handled press, the offensive line has been very good this season, but you're right that Michigan's pass rush and defensive line are probably the best Indiana had seen so far. And, you could make a case that Ohio State's is going to be even better. And as well as the offensive line has played this season, when Curtis Rourke has faced pressure, that's when we've seen him, and it has a lot to do with just his mobility issues this season, that he hasn't been as mobile as, honestly, I thought he was going to be more mobile than he's been, like, coming into the season. I thought we were going to get a little bit more mobility out of Curtis Rourke than what Indiana's seen. So I think when he's faced pressure in the pass game this season, it hasn't always been super smooth. He hasn't always handled it well, and it's not usually throwing the ball into harm's way. But I mean, sometimes it's, he takes 1 or 2 more sacks than he should. It's just having to throw the ball away because there's just nothing there. And sometimes it's coverage sacks, sometimes it's facing pressure, just getting pressured. But he's a very calm, level-headed quarterback who's not going to make a lot of mistakes, but it hasn't always been smooth when he's faced repeated pass pressure. And yeah, if that happens again on Saturday, that could be a problem.
Yeah, the parallel that I can draw was the first game of the season against Florida International. They struggled with some pressure in that game, and Rourke put some throws out there that he probably shouldn't have. And so I bring that up because that was the first time the O-line had played together in a game. And so it makes me wonder if, now having the injury behind them, a couple weeks to play together in practice and just build some chemistry, whether or not that will be something that improves. I think you can, without being definitive about that, give some benefit of the doubt to Bob Bostad that he can kind of get some level of comfort back with that group. But having said that, 4 of the 11 sacks that Rourke has taken came in that Michigan game. And I went back and looked at the film on Michigan's pressures, and they got home in a lot of different ways in that game. They got pressure just beating tackles on the edge one-on-one. They got home on stunts. They got home collapsing the pocket, which I think Ohio State might really try to do. If both of Indiana's injuries were at guard, so their weakness is probably the interior, and Ohio State has got 5-star NFL dudes up the middle that can probably, all you got to do is get Curtis Rourke uncomfortable in those first couple seconds, and that could be the difference. And I think that Michigan was able to do that to a certain extent. The other thing about Ohio State's defense here, they've given up 3 touchdowns, Owen, in the last 4 games. So, I don't think you look at them and you think, oh, it's because of X, Y, or Z. They're just good top to bottom. This is a great roster, great talent, well coached. This is just a very well run defense that has no real weaknesses. And I talked about Ohio State wanting to do long drives to chew up the clock. I think Indiana's going to have to do that unless Ohio State makes mistakes, and they just haven't had a track record of doing that. I went back and looked at the Nebraska game, that Ohio State had. And Nebraska, they had 3 field goal drives. They had a touchdown drive. They were all longer drives. So you can move the ball against Ohio State. You're just going to have to be patient. You're just going to have to, take what the defense gives you. And that's kind of what I'm seeing with Ohio State. That they can be beat, but it may just all come down to how IU does in the red zone.
Yeah, I think the red zone play hasn't, I guess, looked concerning for us throughout the entire season. So, I mean, in terms of the red zone, I think Indiana has done pretty well. I mean, I think you put something out on the website just a few days ago about Niko Radicic has been, I mean, perfect. Although it hasn't really seen his range been extended, but I mean, in that case, if you get down pretty far, you can at least count on him for points. But that's also a testament to, how well Indiana has done with the red zone offense. So, I mean, I think we discussed earlier on in the season, I think it was me and Seth that had Ohio State, if not winning the Big Ten, being pretty high up there and being kind of the team to beat in the Big Ten. And we talked a lot about their offense at that time, but their defense has been pretty good. I mean, just to put it pretty plainly, I think, Sawyer on the edge is kind of their go-to guy when generating pressure. They have a lot of their front seven has always been very good. They kind of breed really good linebackers at Ohio State as well. So, I mean, for Indiana, I think that's going to be tough, especially when you talk about establishing the run game. And when you already have some health issues at your offensive line and, you didn't run the ball particularly well or as well as you hoped against Michigan, and then you're facing another good front seven against Ohio State, that's going to be something that we're going to have to keep an eye on in the first couple quarters of the game. When you talk about kind of controlling the pace of the game, because the run game's the way to do that. So I think that's the kind of thing that I'm looking at in the first quarter or the first half to see if Indiana can kind of get the running game going. And then once you start getting into that, you can kind of start relying on the RPOs more, play action as well. So, the run game is the thing to look at because it's just going to open up Indiana's offense more as the game goes on.
Okay, Owen. So let's just get right to it. What is your prediction for this game?
So oh my gosh, it's been tough because it's just it's really such a hard game to judge just because of how unprecedented Indiana's season has been, but also we know how good Ohio State has been, but then you start looking at the score comparisons. You talked about the Nebraska game. It's just so weird to judge. I like both offenses here. I think it's going to be fairly high scoring. The defenses can also perform. So, this could end up not being correct at all. Indiana fans are going to be mad at me. I have it 35-31 Ohio State.
Okay. What about you, Seth? Still thinking?
I really don't know, honestly. I think I would still say I think Indiana will cover the spread. I think still. I don't know if they'll win outright because, like we've talked about, Ohio State is a pretty complete team. And like I've said for a lot of the season, Indiana doesn't have really many glaring weaknesses, but I don't think Ohio State does either. And Indiana, I think, needs, like we've talked about, Indiana needs to get off to a good start and ideally get the crowd out of the game and just set the tone for Indiana needs to set the tone for this game early. And if they fall behind, it could get ugly. If they go ahead, I think it's likely to be a close game, one way or another. But I tend to think that it's so hard it's so hard because this is, Ohio State, we've talked about, this is the biggest game for Indiana, in such a long time. Ohio State plays games like this every year. And while I don't know that it's going to matter for Indiana because just the way they operate, and Cignetti is from the Saban School of Coaching, and these players haven't really let the noise get to them all season. I don't know why it would suddenly be a thing now, but sports are weird. You never know what can happen. But I guess I would say it's hard for me to realistically say, double digit underdog, 9.5 point underdog, I'm going to pick them to win outright. So, I think Indiana probably, I would say Ohio State pulls it out. I don't really know what the score I would say would be, but I think Ohio State pulls it out by less than a touchdown.
Okay. I was hoping you'd say Indiana so we didn't have a clean sweep here, but you raise an interesting point though about just the magnitude of the game and whether or not that will matter ultimately, because I agree, Ohio State, it's inarguable they played more big games, including this season, at Oregon, at Penn State. Those are big time games, but they are facing elimination here. I guess Indiana is in terms of the Big Ten championship game as well, but so it's a little bit different.
Ohio State is facing elimination, honestly,
from the title game, the Big Ten.
From the Big Ten title game,
yeah. That's what I'm referring to. But if you think about Indiana this year, that trip out to UCLA, while not a tough environment, the magnitude of the game, like everybody knew, we talked about it at the time, like this is the game where we really find out about who Indiana is. Then they had big noon kickoff. Then they had college game day. Like they've had some very high profile moments where a team that couldn't handle the spotlight might have melted down, and we haven't seen that yet. So I think they're going to be okay with the game. I think it's just going to come down to what happens on the field. I feel like games like this always come down to like a big second half special teams play or a big second half defensive play. I kind of think that's what's going to happen here. I think the offenses will kind of balance each other out. I don't think it's going to be incredibly high scoring, but I agree with you, Seth, that I think it's going to be less than the point spread. And honestly, I think I predict it's going to be a game in the fourth quarter that could go either way. But if you're holding a gun to my head and say, putting my own money on the line, which I'm not, but this is how I would do it, I would say Ohio State's going to win 31-24. But with all those caveats, that I really won't be surprised if Indiana wins it by the exact same score. So
yeah, it's doable. It's really just one of those games, where you don't know that much. So, we'll have to wait till Saturday. It's going to be a fun one to watch, no matter, who you're a fan, no matter who you're covering. I think it's just going to be a really good football game.
Yeah.
If you want an actual score out of me, I think it's going to be lower scoring than you guys think. You look at the over-under is 52.5 total points. Okay. So I would say I'll put it at like 27-23 Ohio State.
Okay. All right. Well, we're all on the record now. We'll see how it goes, and I think we can wrap it up right there. My message to everybody listening to this, if you stuck with us, is just enjoy Saturday. You don't know how often you're going to get these kind of moments. However it goes, this I can tell you as somebody that's been following IU football for more than 40 years at this point. These moments don't come around very often. So just enjoy the fact that you get to experience this kind of game this late in the season. And so let's just see where it goes from there. So for Seth Tao, for Owen Graham, I'm Mike Schumann for E7T Street. We'll catch you guys all the next time.